Hey, what's up, everybody? So Rick's coming at you here from our lair in the basement, and I guess it's been a year now. So, we wanted to do a study on punk rock and all the underground genres that have been a big influence on the Ricks, the kind of music that we love. So I think last year we were talking, of course, about hard punk. And all the influences that came out of that, like, of course, how psychobilly and rockabilly and all the influences that came out of the hard punk movement. It's been about a year since we did that, and of course we've gone on hiatus, and we were just doing pretty much listening parties and reviews maybe for the past year. Of course, we know how COVID has pretty much put the world on halt. The world's in upheaval. There's a change taking place, and I've been thinking about wanting to end the Ricks, just kind of wrap up the social media thing because of the conditions and what's going on. I don't trust social media anymore, but I felt like I had to finish up something I started, and it was our study on punk rock and the underground music genres that have influenced us so much. And so I thought we got to finish this up. I believe in finishing what you start. Of course, as you can hear in the background, Why Riot by Clash. Now, I've never been a big Clash fan, but I think the song is pretty much something for today. Why Riot? When that song was written, it was the beginning of a movement known as punk rock. Now, before we get started here, let's go ahead and for references. Of course, a lot of my information. I'm a big avid reader. One is called England's Dreamin', John Savage. Really need to check this out. This is an excellent book. Goes into the whole English punk rock movement, the Sex Pistols and the Clash and the Damned. Pretty much focuses on the Sex Pistols and what came out of that. But I highly recommend this book. It's actually been a few years since I read it. And of course, also, Please Kill Me, The Uncensored Oral History of Punk Rock by Legs McNeil. Now, this book, of course, here focuses on the whole New York punk movement, what happened and took place there, and of course, its influence, and how it also played a big part in the English punk rock movement. Of course, Legs McNeil was one of the founders of Punk Magazine, and I was always a big follower of that magazine. I actually have some copies of Punk Magazine from that period, like from the 70s and 80s, and I got some reprints. And we're going to get a lot going to go into the the founding of those fanzines that started that whole movement back then. So let's set some mood here. We heard White Riot. Let's look here. Let's go back in time to the 70s. The 70s, what was it? It was an era of political and social upheaval. And we were coming out of the Vietnam War. Although the cynicism and the darkness of what that war did to the psyche of our country. Of course, you have to look at the whole culture, social culture, what was taking place at then. The music, the movies. Music was pretty much just fucking bad, dude. 70s movies was just really flat. There wasn't much there. We had fucking black and white televisions. Color was starting to come around, but you had to have a good bit of money to get a color television. I don't even think we even owned a color TV to about 70, I think about 79 or 80. So, and it even took a while for the damn things to warm up. Music was even worse. You had the whole psychedelic music that was taking place. Stadium rock, bloated, keyboard synthesizer music that was just way over the top. Glitter, big, huge glitter hair, makeup. You had the whole, the stadium rock thing was just pretty much getting out of control. You had Kiss. Kiss was, of course, the big thing at that time. So, of course, you had the political upheaval. You had Watergate and Nixon. You had the country going through the United States going through some economic issues. You had England, which was going through its definitely economic issues with strikes. You had trash piled up in the streets because there was no trash being taken. They had a big trash strike going on. Constant electric outages. England was, and actually today England's still not much different. It's still really not much better. We had a lot of racial issues and immigration going on in England, and people were angry. There was no work, and they were betrayed by their government. So, what are you going to do when you're living in a country like England or America? I mean, you take New York, because we're going to focus primarily on England and New York. Because again, when we're talking about punk rock and we're talking about the underground social cultures, you got to think about the cultural and influential impact that this music had. Punk rock, what is it? The name, of course, I remember when I was doing jail. I used to actually go to prison. I used to volunteer work in prison, and they used the word, his ass got punked today. Hey, he got his ass punked. And they would always use that word punk, of course it means getting raped up the ass. And so that word pretty much describes what punk rock is. The people who were not musicians, people who felt like they were getting it up the ass from their politicians, their governments, the businesses, the corporations, the jobs were just shit at that point. People were unemployed. They were getting screwed. So what a perfect name to call being in punk rock. You're getting it up the ass from everybody. So out of that came a movement. Pretty much kids, young kids that were just pissed off. They didn't like the music of that period. They didn't want to hear the music of that period. They didn't identify with it. They didn't relate to it. And out of that came where these kids wanted to learn and try to say something, express themselves, to say what they truly felt, that they felt that the music and the culture at that time was not being honest. They wanted to speak their honesty. And they grabbed a fucking musical instrument. As a matter of fact, there was a British fanzine, I think, called Sniff and Glue. And at that time, they had a little diagram someone drew up called 3 chords. They had, I'm thinking, this is a chord, and this is a chord, and this is a chord. And there you learn how to play. Go out and play and form a band. And that was the mentality of punk rock then. It wasn't about going to learn to play an instrument. It wasn't about going to music school. It wasn't about trying to be another Eric Clapton or Ace Frehley. It was about learning to play, stripping it down to basics, releasing an energy that was honest and true than what the kids wanted to say. They weren't rock stars. They didn't want to be rock stars. They didn't relate to the rock stars in that period of time. Again, disco ruled at that time too. Disco was really big, and how could kids like in England living on the dole, which is welfare, or here in New York City in America, a city that's about bankrupt, anyone knew how the Bowery was, is not the Bowery of today. They definitely cleaned up New York City. And it's not the city as it was in the 70s. It was a very dark, violent, poverty-ridden city. And out of that, I mean, you had drunks, you had druggies everywhere, and out of those cities came a new movement I believe was born in New York and in England. And of course, out of that came venues, CBGBs. And I can't remember the name of the venues in England, but 2 of them in England rose up, and they were pretty much just old warehouses. And this is where the bands played. So they started forming their own music based off only what they knew how to play, just a basic few chords. And out of that came their own style and their own fashion. They weren't emulating the style and the fashion of that time, which were beautiful, glamorous clothes. They were taking the clothes pretty much you would get at a 5 and dime store or in a trash bag, tear it up, rip it up, and make your own style. Instead of wearing long hair, the punks were cutting their hair. They were cutting it jagged. You know what I mean? Now let's go back to, of course, New York. At that time, you had Richard Hell and the Voidoids, I think was the name of the band. But Richard Hell And a lot of people, of course, say that that style, that punk style that we know, came from Richard Hell. And that may be true. I'm not even going to argue that fact. It doesn't really matter. And supposed to be Malcolm McLaren, who was in New York at that period in the very early mid-70s, seen this, what Richard Hell and the whole CBGBs and Bowery punk movement was getting formed, and they took it back to England. I don't know, that could be true. I don't think it really matters. But I just think at that time we were starting to see very similar. When you have them kind of cultural issues going on, you're going to have that rebellion. You're going to have an opposite reaction to what everyone else is doing. Nevertheless, a new style was being born, whether it was from Richard Hell or Johnny Rotten, a spiky, jagged hair look, your clothes ripped, safety pins. And of course, safety pins became the first body piercing. Man, I mean, that was kind of like the first thing there was the body piercings, was the safety pins. Before you ever had to stud. Now today, it's a big thing. Everyone does the safety pins now today, and but back then it was very odd. I remember when I was little seeing kids on television. They were talking about the punk movement, you know, the documentaries they would have, and you would see running around with safety pins in their cheeks and their nose, and you're like, holy shit, man. There was nothing like that. That was so contrary to what you were seeing, what everyone else was doing. Kiss, you know, the big band at that time was wearing the makeup and the big platform boots. Punks weren't. Punks were wearing leather jackets or studded wristbands or ripped clothes, neckties. The mainstream bands, even like Aerosmith and Ted Nugent or Emerson, Lake and Palmer, whatever kind of fucking bands you want to think about, they weren't dressing that way. So this was the fashion of the street kids that was coming out of poverty. There was no Hot Topics at that point. Even though McLaren and his and I think Vivian Westwood, his wife, they formed a sex shop in England, which was on the King's Road, and they were selling, of course, these clothes at pretty high prices. But nevertheless, the kids were still forming their own fashion out of this. Now let's go to New York City. At that point, you had bands like Patti Smith, Television, of course, the Talking Heads, and the Ramones. You had the Dictators. So many bands were coming up out of the New York scene. And of course, the venue was formed. We all know Hilly Crystal formed CBGB's. Originally, his vision was country, bluegrass, and blues, but he wasn't getting that. He wasn't drawing that kind of a crowd. He was drawing in street kids, kids that wanted to play their music, their own honest music, and not cover tunes. They weren't playing cover tunes. They were writing their own music, and he really related that. He wanted them to play their own music, and so he promoted that original band. So he would let these kids come in and play. And anyone ever know about CBGB's that day? It was a shithole, a fucking shithole. I mean, you had rats everywhere. Of course, there were stories of Hilly's dog shitting all over the place. They actually handmade, they built their own stage, and I heard they were always having a problem with the stage and the sound system. And so these bands were coming in and they were playing their own original music. And why were they doing that? Because it was a natural reaction to the cultural issues that was going on at that time. You had violence, politics out of control. People felt like there was no hope. And when you have that, you're going to have them create and write their own music. And so they were playing at CBGB's, and a new movement was getting to be born. Even where mainstream music, you started having big music critics and publications were coming down to the Bowery, going to this disgusting shithole bar known as CBGB's, watching these bands. As a matter of fact, the birth at that time was Punk Magazine. John Holstrom and Legs McNeil, two young guys, I always heard that they were the ones that actually coined the phrase punk. And out of that came their publication. And one day they were doing the legwork for their first issue of Punk Magazine. They were doing an interview with Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground, you know, and of course they were the bands at that time. And Lou Reed was actually at CBGB's sitting there, and I heard he had a really shitty fucking attitude, man. And they talked about this in their interviews, how bad it was. Trying to interview the guy, he'd come off really cocky, full of his own shit. And so they're interviewing him, and then these guys get on stage. 4 guys with leather jackets, and they kick in. And I believe, if I'm right, it was Blitzkrieg Bop they were playing. And, of course, they fucked up the song, and there were some problems, and then they jumped right back into the tune again, and they were playing loud. And the fucking club just went crazy. And at that point, Legs, McNeil, and Holstrom said they didn't give a fuck about Lou Reed at that time. He didn't seem very interesting. He actually, you know, the glam of interviewing him just didn't seem to fucking matter, because the Ramones had taken the stage. The first time they'd ever heard them play, it just was nothing like them at that time. And so Lou Reed's interview just seemed like it lost its appeal to him. So anyway, the first issue was come out, and of course it was the first of many. They covered bands, not rock star bands. As a matter of fact, a lot of people don't know, Punk Magazine did one of the very first interviews with AC/DC. AC/DC, now everyone like jerks off to AC/DC Day. They're like the legends. You never want to play Guitar Hero on a video game, wants to be AC/DC. But there was a time AC/DC was not like. They did not interview AC/DC. They were a band everyone tried to avoid. So, but Punk Magazine actually did one of the very first interviews with them. And so, you know, it developed this reputation of interviewing individuals and bands that most rock publications wouldn't even begin to even look at, wouldn't even think about. They wanted unique individuals, people that stood out, that had their own sound. And the Ramones was probably one of the bands that really dominated. They really did a lot of interviews with them. They saw something within it that really stood out. So this publication really was taken off in New York, and it became the voice of the punk movement in America, and especially New York. And again, people were coming down. You had David Bowie. Now, a lot of people talked about, before we get into Bowie, of course, was Iggy and the Stooges and the MC5 and their influence on, you know, they were the fathers of true punk rock. And that may or may not be, and you got to understand, mainstream avoided Iggy. No one wanted to touch him. So he hung out a lot at CBGB's, and of course, that drew the likes of David Bowie. Of course, he was the rock star. He was that's what I'm saying. It's good to know that you got people in mainstream music that was appreciating something different and unique that the Velvet Underground was bringing, and the whole New York punk scene. You know, that had its roots in garage rock. And you had Bowie coming down there and watching these bands and appreciating them, and then the music critics were coming down, other publications, and then you had record producers coming in and watching what was going on, and then something started to happen. Bands started getting signed. You had Blondie, you had Patti Smith, Television, the Talking Heads, the Ramones, as I said earlier, and there were just so many of them coming on, and they were getting signed. But I want to primarily focus on the Ramones, because, dudes, if there is a king of punk rock, a band that really shows what punk rock is, it was the Ramones. Now I want to jump to 1976. Very important time. That was the centennial year of America. July 4th, 1976. The Ramones was just starting to get a pretty good name for themselves. They had signed a record deal with Sire Records. Linda, the record company signed them, and then of course Danny Fields was their manager. They took them to England, and I think that was a pretty brilliant thing. Instead of bringing them somewhere in America, to play a big centennial show, they said, why not take them to England? So they booked a show for July 4th, 1976 at a punk venue in England, and they went there and they blew the fucking lid off of that country. It just set a fire going on. Again, punk rock was already taking off. Contrary, a lot of people say, some people said that the Pistols and the Clash hadn't even been formed at that point in time. That's not true. That's not true. The bands were already there, but they were yet really starting to make a name for themselves. The Ramones kick in there, and they just fucking conquered that country. They set that country on fire. And what a place to play to show America's 200th year of independence than to play England. At that time, you had I think the Sex Pistols. They all wanted to meet the Ramones. The Clash. I think they pulled them up through a window, and they got to hang out with them. And I remember the Clash. Strummer was actually talking about that. Strummer was like, you know, we want to play, but we're just not good, man. You know, we're not ready yet. We haven't practiced.